are more than 100 unique styles of beer, each with their own set of ingredients, process, guidelines, history, and experience. If you're a beer lover, an industry leader, or somewhere in between, a better knowledge of beer style will improve your life and your work.
Welcome to A Sense of Beer Style, essential beer style training for those who want to lead in food and beverage. I'm Julia Herz.
And I'm Jeremy Storton.
We're advanced Cicerones, beer judges, home brewers, and we're excited to guide you through the vast and wonderful world of beer styles. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Sense of Beer Style with Julia and Jeremy, and we are in Beer Judge Certification Program guidelines for American Wild Ale. And that's a pretty fun place to be, pretty exciting.
Yep.
And
It's
I
about to
think
get funky.
it's about to get funky. And these beers, we're going to talk about Brett beer for this dedicated episode, but we're kicking it off, I think, with the big picture of American Wild Ale, which Brett beer is part of that category, because kicking it off is important for the big picture, right? American Wild Ale is not just Brett beer. Wild is not just Brettanomyces. There's a lot of differentiation and different understanding of what is sour, what is wild, what is Brett. And so we're going to get into all that. And I also want a quick disclaimer of the word American for American Wild Ale. And the guidelines even talk about this. You know, that word doesn't mean it has to be based on a beer style that is an American beer style. As a matter of fact, this whole kind of category flourished because American craft brewers were starting to dabble and trying to do Belgian ales and beers from other countries, and then just took them to an even more wacky, funky place.
Yeah, totally. This is a category full of variants that came from the American attitude of anything you can do, I can do better type of idea. And so that's kind of where these sit. You know, I love talking. I love Brett beer. It's very cerebral for me. You know, the whole notion of where Brettanomyces came from. We all know that Saccharomyces, essentially breaks down to sugar fungus, but Brettanomyces, that's British fungus. That is a British yeast, and inherently, and that's where kind of we get the whole etymology comes from. Is really fun, and when we dive into some of those the British styles and the history of brewing, they kind of relied on this little gem to ferment their beers long before we had the technology to do things a little bit better, right?
Yes. And
Yeah.
I love that. And before you take us to ingredients, Jeremy, because it's your turn to do that, I do want to emphasize there's more than 10 and ongoing documented strains of Brettanomyces. So when you if you homebrew it, if you professionally brew it, if you're looking at recipes, you would go to yeast company A, B, or C that's banking this yeast, and you're going to need to know what strain you want. And there's different characteristics that display and express from those different strains, and double digits plus of types of Brettanomyces yeast. So it's its own category of yeast. That should be clear. It's not considered lager. It's not considered ale. Brettanomyces is its own category, but it's not one type of yeast. Very, very high level kind of introduction there.
Yeah, and I think it would. I think it serves us to just kind of understand this bug a little bit better. This is a very hardy yeast. This is a very enduring yeast, and it's the slow and steady yeast. It'll take a long time to do its job, but it will do its job very thoroughly. And its job is to attenuate the beers, to gobble up all the sugars of any size, and leave behind very little. That's just kind of what you need to understand about Brettanomyces as opposed to Saccharomyces. It's a very, very different behaving creature. But when we're talking about Brett beer subcategory, just understanding that we are now into these specialty beers. We're not talking about specific styles or even specific regions. Now we're starting to look at the variants. And so when we talk about the ingredients, well, basically the ingredients are simple. Any beer style that uses wholly or partially Brettanomyces. And so, I mean, in theory, you could have a Brett American Blonde. You could have a Brett Munich Helles. That is possible and works within the realm of this particular subcategory. So if you want to know the ingredients of this Brett beer, then you have to look at that particular base style and know that they're adding Brettanomyces to it to kind of finish it off in the long haul and let it age for a bit. Or they might be using Brettanomyces solely and to let it just really take the time to do its job. That's the easy part of this ingredients. Let's talk about what we can see with a beer like this.
And I've just got one example from my cellar. It's competition entry that I was given, and you might be surprised it's dark. That's actually a really fun one to kind of showcase because the base style doesn't have to even be designated. You can designate a base style or not, right? It can be just a Brett beer, and you get to the version of that Brett beer with any combination of ingredients that you like. So appearance is variable based on style and could be clear, maybe not. And it's going to be like when we get to the vital statistics, there's a spectrum. So you're going to see visible evidence of what was fermented. I think that's the key. But Brett beer that has been fermented, obviously with Brettanomyces yeast, just like ale yeast or lager yeast, you're not going to see that yeast in the beer. That's my explanation of
Yeah.
appearance, and it's as squishy as it gets, and that's fun and wonderful and wide open.
Yeah, and that's because this subcategory is just like grab a beer, add bread to it. That's this category. So when we get to aroma, some of it is going to be based upon what style is that base beer to begin with. It could be anything. So you kind of have to refer to Exhibit A first, and then after you figure out what that is, then come back. Now let's look at Exhibit B. B is in Brett. So when we're talking we get past the base style. We understand the base style, and you go back to listen to any of the episodes that we've done, the Stylecast that we've done. That's the base style. When we get to Brett, now when Brett or Brettanomyces really gets started fermenting, and it's still pretty early, still pretty young, it's going to kick off a lot of fruity flavors. One of my favorite, in particular, I taste in young Brettanomyces beers is overripe pineapple. It's that pineapple where you're thinking, oh my gosh, we've had this in the fridge too long. We better eat it tonight with our teriyaki chicken, or we got to throw it out tomorrow. That's the point that this can get with that overripe pineapple. And it's wonderful. It's a wonderful aroma. It's a very specific aroma. You can get other kind of fruity flavors that go into that as well. But if you have a Brettanomyces beer that has been aging for a year or more, well, a lot of that fruit's going to be gone, and we're going to start getting some of those funky flavors. Funky meaning it could be a sweaty farm animal, it could be hay, it could be rodeo grounds. I was just moving a bunch of bark in my backyard this weekend, and I got just a hint of what it reminded me of Brettanomyces beer a little bit, just because there's that kind of like earthy funk to it, and it was great. Um, Understand though, please understand, and forgive me, Julie, I'm going to dip into flavor just a touch,
You
but
go.
understand that Brettanomyces does produce some acids, but it does not produce a sour beer. It produces a funky beer. It needs to get a little help from its friends to create that sourness. And here I am talking about aroma. And so if you get an impression of sourness, if you smell something that makes you think, oh, that's sour, there might be something else involved there. So keep that in mind. But now take that. Let's go into flavor now that you've had a taste of it.
Sure. And we try to keep Sense of Beer style, I think, accessible to all.
Mm-hmm.
This is one of those when I sat for Master Cicerone, which I still have yet to accomplish, but I have one of the slides in my study notebook is kind of the Brett essay, right? And so it's really, when it comes to flavor, reading the guidelines is helpful, but trying as many Brett beers, I think, is what it's really all about. Brett, for example, will ferment certain sugars that are never accessible to standard Saccharomyces yeast, right?
Yeah.
Brett will nibble away at other things that aren't even sugars and go after protein, right? Brett will alter when with hops the flavor based on the exposure and length of time. Brett is used often as a secondary priming sugar when you are bottling, or Vol traditionally does that, the beer. So when you get to flavor, again, there's just no one way to nail it. And Jeremy was alluding to it in the aroma. But there's kind of the easy kind of People Magazine version is there's the fruity side of Brett, like definitely pineapple notes,
Yeah.
and a spectrum within that category of volatiles. And then that funky barnyard leather, tobacco, horse blanket, mousy side of things. There's a lot of chemical precursors that then can evolve. And because Brett, the reason it's good to use as kind of a secondary priming sugar if you're after some of those flavors is because it takes its time. It's a really good, I think, addition for when you're going to lay down or cellar a beer, and it will slowly carbonate that beer. So all of that is kind of, again, back to the variable by base style for flavor. And it can be mild because maybe it's not aged enough yet, right? Or maybe it was um,
Or maybe
not.
it's blended.
Yes, could be blended and kind of
Yeah.
diluted down, right? The example I'm getting, there's definitely acetobacter in this. And,
Mhm.
Brett, in the absence of oxygen, there's anaerobic and aerobic conditions, will produce certain things. I have the absolute presence in this competition entry, which I shall remain having it unnamed because that's not the relevant point. Although, thank you to the entrant. Acetobacter, right? So you could have this pecking order in Brett beers, where even the style guidelines say fermented with Sac and Brett or with Brett only. So Saccharomyces would be it. And if I'm getting Acetobacter, we're really kind of already bumping it into another category that Jeremy and I will be doing a show on the subvariant there. So Brett should be clean with Saccharomyces notes or just Brett standalone. With
Yep.
that, minimal to aggressive in what you are getting based on the age. And so you don't want it to be so aggressive and funky that it tastes like one of those bad aged cheeses that was in your fridge for too long, right? That's just not a great thing. And you will notice certainly potential of lactic acid that displays because of the Brett, but that wasn't added. That's the point I'm trying to make. It will bring forth certain other agents, but not added because then you're in a different style that you should be entering or evaluating it. The malt flavors are less pronounced, and certainly it's more about the yeast for sure, and then the ethanol. And then I would say that, and we'll talk about mouthfeel in a moment, but Brett really does a great job. As I said, it's fermenting a lot of the sugars that Saccharomyces traditionally can't get at. So you find these beers as they are aged and cellared to be drier. And they're very palatable because of that. Like I just love the fact that when you get a Brett beer, man, if it's not too funky, it didn't go to an unintended place that the brewer never scripted. They're great food beers, and we'll talk about pairing at the end.
Yeah.
So I lean into mouthfeel as another component of flavor at this
Yeah.
juncture.
I love it. And that was a perfect segue because kind of like as the flavor changes with Brettanomyces as you age it, let it and really let it take its time, or we're talking year or years. When you get it when it's pretty young, the base it's base style dependent. But let's move on from the base style. When you get a Brett beer and it's fairly young, it might have some body to it. It might have light to medium body. But if you get it after it's sat for a year and really done its work, then it can be dry as a bone. It can be, and I use this comparison deliberately, it can be very champagne-like, but in with a little bit more funk character to it. But you get that just light body, that bright effervescence, and it can be really fun. It can be tantalizing, and it can be, if you use it well, it can be a really incredible component to your meal and your experience, and that's just exciting. Um, but let's talk about and with these subcategories, there's a lot of things that just don't connect like the other categories. But let's talk about a style comparison and just see what discourse you have on that.
Right. So remember, to reground, we're talking American Wild Ale 2021 BJCP style guidelines. We're on Brett beer, which is the first within the wild ale category. And we've said that it doesn't have to have a base style. So if you're going to try to blind test or test yourself, you could put it with any of, if you do have examples that have a base style that is a Brett version, that base style. That's going to be the best way. That's really clean and easy to get to know the Brett expression and how it starts to display compared to the same beer with that same base style. So I think that's really important. But you're just going to notice, as I said, under flavor, they're usually going to be drier and more attenuated because you're getting more of those sugars because the Brett does such a good job. Might lend some fruitiness, that funkiness of tobacco, leather, horse blanket, all that, mousy. It's welcome in many environments and including my beer circles for sure.
Yeah.
So that's the difference of what you're looking for if you are kind of to gauge it against a base style.
Yeah, and if you're listening to this and you're not a fan of Brett beers, when you say these descriptive words out loud, it sounds kind of like, oh, I don't want to taste leather and tobacco in my beer, but but when you taste it, the it's a different experience. So if you haven't tried it, go and try it. So when you go to try it, what we need to look for are the word Brett, which is short for Brettanomyces. Good examples of this are Boulevard Saison with Brett, Hill Farmstead's Arthur. And I don't know the current state of this brewery, but a classic that was originally from Oregon was Logsden Saison Bretta. That was the first Brett beer I ever had, and it was life-changing. Lost Abbey, Brett Devo, Russian River Sanctification, and I'm so excited. They're opening up a tap room near where I live, the Brewery Saison Rue. But we're looking for Brett. We're looking for Brettanomyces, and there's a lot of breweries, even home brewers, that are playing with this fun little critter. So seek them out and taste them. Uh, we don't have a lot of vital stats. Do you want to say anything in relation to vital stats before we move on to glass and temp, Julia?
Nope, I'm good. Why don't you
Yeah.
start us off on glass and temp since you got gypped and you didn't get
Sure,
to do
sure.
vitals?
Well, and the reason why we're skipping vital stats on this is because, like we've said before, it is style dependent, and we're not going to rehash every style in this one episode. So you can go back and kind of see where it ought to be. But Brett will finish out a little bit drier in the final gravity. That's just one thing I want to say. When we get into a glass type, this is not your average Friday night. I need to take the edge off my work week type of beer. Unless you're interested in that. To me, this is something special. This is something interesting. We can go out and just have a regular burger, but when we go out and have like an elk burger, it's like, okay, this is different. Let's have some fun with this. So for me, I want to put this in a nice glass. My preference for beers like this are a stemmed tulip, but
Mm.
a goblet or chalice would be fantastic. If you're at someone else's house and all you've got is what you got, a white wine glass is fantastic for a beer like this as well, because it'll allow you to swirl, allow you to sniff. That Teku glass that Julia has is fantastic. That's where I want to go with these. Now, when it comes to temperature, these are fun. And if you're interested in learning and geeking out like us, then start this beer cold. We're looking at like 48 degrees Fahrenheit or 5 degrees Celsius. And let it sit in your hand as you sip it. This is going to change drastically as you sip it, as it warms up. And so play with it. See what your sweet spot is for a beer like this. And it's going to be kind of a fun experiment. That said, let's talk about food.
So this is a beer that, because the style has so many options, and again, it's about the yeast that's being used, it's really unfair to script what you should pair it with, right?
Yeah.
I don't think that's fair. I do find myself though, where sour, tart, and funky, you want things I think that have synergies with cheese. I mean, sour, tart, and funky is going to stand up. The acidity stands up to fat and the richness of fat. What does cheese have? Lots of that. Cheese, the more advanced age, has really good advanced funky flavors. So I would say go to your local cheesemonger, get the funkiest, tell them, say, I'm doing a tasting with Britannomyces beers, and I would imagine they know exactly what you're talking about because they probably get this once a week or once a month. And tell them you want the funkiest, stinkiest, craziest cheeses possible, and then have 4 or 5 Brett beers with it and go for it. Have some water, have some, soda crackers or unsalted matzah or whatever to clean your palate. Have some good music on. Jeremy's going to say jazz. I'll say honky tonk, whatever. And pair it with the moment of the universe, the cosmos can bring you so many things when they are all combined. So your Brett beer alone in the glass, what is that going to taste like? And then on top of that, what is it going to taste like when it's combined with that cheesemonger's version of their pairing of cheese? So I suggest you start there, and you will certainly go forth much further.
And that is fantastic advice, Julia, because you go to that great cheese place, you ask for the cheese that smells the worst but tastes amazing. Bring that home, bring this beer home, invite your friends over, and then you'll find out who your real friends are, because they will either be honest or they're like, I can't drink it. This is for a refined palate. This is not, hey, you want to get into craft beer, try this. This is a little bit more advanced from a palate standpoint. But if you have people that love wine and love cheese, then that's the entry point. With when I've got a kind of a young Brett beer that is manifesting in some of those fruity flavors, I'd love this with a grilled salmon. I've had grilled salmon with a beautiful saison with just a touch of Brett character to it, and it was amazing. You get something a little bit funkier, a little bit gamier as far as beer goes. I'd love that with grilled veggies is obvious, but elk, duck, lamb, maybe some cassoulet would be really fun. Camembert cheese is always good because they kind of add this earthy, the game, gamey meat. And now you have this gamey beer, and you kind of use that as a bridge to connect. It's really fun and can be really exciting. So go out and try it and see what happens.
Yep. And if you really want to dive in and you find yourself wishing we'd have gotten more advanced or geeky, maybe once we're finally done with all the style shows, we will go to that deeper level. But there's so much research out there to read. Remember and review of this show is that doesn't have to be American. That just kind of is an ode to the history. Doesn't have to have a base style that it's mirroring. Is a combination of Saccharomyces yeast and Brett that influenced and fermented that beer, or just Brett. So it doesn't have to be 100% Brett. So there's a lot of it doesn't have to be's, and that's the fun. So read up, I think explore. Definitely, the last thing is if you're brewing with Brett, you want to have clean brewing practices and not have that wild yeast influence any of your brewing equipment so much that it carries over batch to batch. So that's always good, is when you're working with wild yeast, you want to make sure that you have good contamination control practices. So you have your clean IPA in April, and then you do your Brett beer in June, and then back to October, you're making your Oktoberfest, and your Oktoberfest doesn't become a Brett bomb. So that's my advice, and I'm sticking to it.
Excellent. So go forth and go find some Brett. Cheers.
Cheers.
Thank you for listening to A Sense of Beer Style, the essential beer style training for those who want to lead in food and beverage. With advanced Cicerones, me, Julia,
And me, Jeremy.
Tune into the next episode as we continue exploring the world of beer styles and what to make of them. We encourage you to listen to the prepisodes to build your foundation and better understand beer styles.
And before the next episode, I'd like to ask you to review the show and let us know what you'd like featured in upcoming episodes. Until next time, here's to you and your sense of beer style. Thank you for listening. Cheers.